Julian, please stop. The words were a ghost of a whisper in the cavernous bedroom, barely audible over the sound of their own breathing and the distant, muted hum of the city that never slept. Alara's voice was meant to be a command, a plea, but it came out broken, frayed at the edges by a wave of pleasure that she hated herself for feeling. Her fingers clenched into the cool, impossibly soft silk of the sheets, her knuckles white against the charcoal gray fabric. His hand was tangled in her long, dark hair, not pulling, but holding her steady, an anchor in a storm of sensation he himself had created. "We can't." The protest died on her lips as he shifted his weight, his body a warm, heavy presence that was both a prison and a strange, terrifying comfort. A soft, involuntary gasp escaped her, a sound of pure, unwilling surrender that echoed in the quiet air between them. "Shh, Alara." His voice was low, a deep murmur against her ear, carrying the scent of expensive whiskey and absolute control. "Just let go." And the most damnable part was, a part of her wanted to. A very small, traitorous part of her wanted to forget why she was here, in the penthouse apartment of Julian Croft, a man more than twice her age, a man who held her father's entire future in the palm of his hand. She was Alara Vance, a 22-year-old art history student who, until a month ago, thought her biggest problem was a looming term paper. He was the 48-year-old real estate magnate whose name was etched onto half the skyscrapers that glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights of Manhattan spread out below them like a carpet of fallen stars, a beautiful, indifferent witness to the ugly bargain that had been struck. This wasn't love. This wasn't even passion. It was a transaction, a debt being paid in the most intimate currency imaginable. And as another tremor of forbidden pleasure coursed through her, she squeezed her eyes shut, hating him, but hating herself even more for the way her body was betraying every principle she had ever held dear. Only 6 weeks ago, the scent of expensive whiskey and silk sheets was an alien world, a universe that existed only in glossy magazines or the movies she and Liam would sometimes watch, curled up together on his second-hand sofa. 6 weeks ago, her life was measured in different sensations. The chemical smell of the dark room where Liam developed his photographs, the comforting aroma of burnt coffee from the campus library's old machine, and the faint, sweet scent of the cheap vanilla perfume she'd worn since she was a teenager. Her world then was small, but it was vibrant, and it was hers. It was a world that revolved around Liam. He was all sharp angles and restless energy, his eyes constantly scanning the world for the perfect shot, a sliver of light hitting a puddle in just the right way, or the tired, beautiful lines on a stranger's face. But his gaze was always softest when it landed on her. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way that made her feel both completely exposed and utterly safe. He would take pictures of her when she wasn't looking, capturing her laughing at one of his terrible jokes, or lost in a book, her brow furrowed in concentration. He called these his real Alara collection. Their dates were walks through Central Park in the autumn, their hands buried in their pockets, their shoulders bumping together. They would share a single pretzel from a street vendor, debating which mustard was superior, their arguments full of laughter. Their dreams were as simple as they were immense. He would become a renowned photojournalist, she would curate a small, respected art gallery, and they would find a tiny apartment in Brooklyn with enough light for his plants and her books. It was a future built on hope and shared affection, a fragile, beautiful thing they were carefully constructing together. Her home life was just as stable, just as reassuring. Her father, David Vance, was the anchor of their family, a quiet, gentle man with kind eyes and a predictable routine. For 25 years, he had worked as a senior accountant at Croft Real Estate Development, one of the biggest firms in the city. He was a man of numbers and spreadsheets, meticulous and reliable. Alara had always thought of his job as terribly boring, but she admired his dedication. He was the kind of father who would stay up late to help her with math homework she didn't understand, who remembered the name of every artist she ever mentioned, and who would leave a freshly brewed cup of tea on her nightstand before he left for work in the morning. He wasn't a man of grand gestures, but his love was a steady, constant presence, a foundation upon which she had built her entire life. He and her mother, Sarah, had a quiet, comfortable love, the kind that settles in after decades of shared history. Their small apartment in Queens was filled with worn furniture and the smell of her mother's baking. It was a haven, a place utterly removed from the cold, ruthless ambition of Manhattan that lay just a bridge away. The foundation of that haven shattered on a Tuesday. It didn't happen with a shout, but with a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Alara came home from a late class to find her father sitting at their small kitchen table, a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper laid out before him. The embossed letterhead, Croft Enterprises, was unmistakable. He was staring at it, but his eyes were vacant, seeing something far beyond the typed words. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him, shrunken, as if the weight of the world had finally settled on his shoulders and found them too narrow. Her mother was in the armchair in the corner, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hands twisting a damp tissue over and over again. The television was off. The radio was silent. All the familiar, comforting sounds of her home had vanished. When she asked what was wrong, her father's voice, when he finally found it, was a dry, cracking whisper. He confessed everything. The story tumbled out in broken pieces, a narrative of shame and desperation that seemed to belong to a stranger, not the dependable, loving man she knew. It had started small, a few online bets to chase away the monotony, the quiet thrill of a win. But then the wins became losses, and the losses grew larger, and the desperate chase to win it all back began. He had started borrowing from the company accounts, just small amounts at first, always intending to pay it back after the next big win. But the big win never came. The small amounts snowballed into a monstrous, unthinkable sum. The letter on the table wasn't a warning, it was a final audit summary. An internal investigation had uncovered everything. He had embezzled nearly $2 million from Julian Croft. The number hung in the air, obscene and suffocating. $2 million. It was an amount so vast it was abstract, a figure from a different reality. Alara felt a wave of nausea. This couldn't be real. Her father, her gentle, honest father, was a criminal. The days that followed were a blur of hushed, frantic phone calls and sleepless nights. They met with a lawyer, a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit who spoke in grim, practical terms. He explained the legal ramifications: grand larceny, embezzlement, years in federal prison. He talked about asset seizure, about how Croft Enterprises would take everything they had, which wasn't much to begin with. Their home, their meager savings, everything would be gone. The public shame would be unbearable. David Vance, the trusted accountant, the quiet neighbor, would be branded a thief. Alara watched her parents crumble. Her father barely ate or slept, the guilt carving new, deep lines into his face. Her mother moved through the apartment like a ghost, her eyes red and swollen from constant crying. The happy, stable world Alara had known was dissolving into a nightmare of legal fees and impending doom. Liam tried to be there for her, but she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. How could she explain that her father was a felon? How could she burden him with the filth and shame that now clung to her family name? She pushed him away with vague excuses about family illness, and she could see the hurt and confusion in his eyes, adding another layer of guilt to her already heavy heart. She felt utterly alone, trapped in a tightening vice of desperation. One night, unable to sleep, she sat in the dark living room, the blue light of her laptop screen illuminating her face. She looked at a photo of her father from last summer's barbecue, smiling, flipping a burger, and she thought of him in a prison uniform, his kind eyes dulled by despair. The image was so visceral, so horrifying, that it sparked something within her. A fierce, protective resolve hardened in her chest. She would not let that happen. She would not stand by and watch her family be destroyed. The lawyers were useless, the debt was insurmountable. There was only one person who could stop this, one person who held all the power: Julian Croft. Ignoring her father's tearful pleas not to get involved, not to humiliate herself, she began to type. Her hands trembled as she searched for a way to contact him directly, bypassing the layers of assistants and legal teams. She found a private email address for his executive office, a long shot, but the only shot she had. With a deep, shuddering breath, she composed a message. A desperate, formal plea for a meeting, for a chance to talk, to beg for mercy. She stared at the screen for a long time, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was no longer just a daughter, no longer just a student or a girlfriend. She was a woman on the edge of an abyss, about to make a choice that would change everything. With a final, silent prayer, she moved the cursor and clicked send. The reply came less than 24 hours later. It wasn't from Julian Croft himself, but from an address signed by a Catherine Shaw, executive assistant to Mr. Croft. The email was brief, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. It simply stated that Mr. Croft could accommodate a meeting at 4 p.m. the following day at his corporate headquarters. There was no mention of her father, no hint of compassion, just an address and a time. It felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. The entire next day was a fog of anxiety. Alara stood in front of her closet for an hour, feeling the pathetic inadequacy of her wardrobe. What does one wear to beg for their father's life? She finally settled on a simple black dress she'd bought for a scholarship interview, pairing it with her only pair of sensible heels. She felt like a child playing dress-up, a fraud about to walk into the lion's den. The journey into Manhattan felt like crossing into another dimension. The rumbling subway, packed with ordinary people, gave way to the soaring glass and steel canyons of the financial district. Croft Tower was an architectural marvel, a shard of dark, smoked glass that pierced the sky, seeming to scrape against the clouds. It was designed to intimidate, to make anyone who entered feel insignificant. The lobby was a cavern of white marble and cold, minimalist art. The air was cool and still, and the only sound was the soft, respectful tapping of keyboards from a recessed reception desk and the silent glide of elevators. Men and women in exquisitely tailored suits moved with a quiet, predatory confidence, their faces set in masks of professional indifference. Ilara's sensible heels clicked loudly on the polished floor, each step feeling like an announcement of her otherness, her desperation. She gave her name to the receptionist, who regarded her with a brief, dismissive glance before directing her to a private elevator bank. The ride to the 80th floor was unnervingly silent and fast. She watched her own reflection in the mirrored walls, a pale, wide-eyed girl with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked terrified, and she hated herself for it. The elevator opened directly into the executive suite. Catherine Shaw, a woman with sharp features and an even sharper suit, greeted her without a smile and led her down a long, silent hallway. The office door was a massive slab of dark wood. Catherine knocked once, then opened it, gesturing for Alara to enter before closing it softly behind her, sealing her in. The room was breathtaking, and not in a good way. It felt less like an office and more like a temple built to the god of power. 3 of the 4 walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a 180-degree panorama of New York City. The city sprawled beneath them, a toy set of buildings and bridges. The sheer height of it was disorienting, designed to give the occupant a sense of mastery over everything below. A massive desk, carved from a single piece of dark, gleaming wood, sat facing the view, commanding the space. Behind it, in a high-backed leather chair, sat Julian Croft. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking out the window, a silhouette against the afternoon sky. He slowly turned as she approached, the chair swiveling with a silent, expensive hiss. In person, he was even more formidable than she had imagined. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit him like a second skin. His hair was dark, with distinguished threads of silver at the temples. His face was handsome, with strong, clean-shaven features, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a cool, intelligent blue, and they assessed her with an unnerving, analytical calm. There was no anger in them, no judgment, just a quiet, calculating intensity. He gestured to one of the 2 chairs in front of his desk. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice smoother and deeper than she expected. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit. Can I get you some water?" The offer of civility was so jarring it almost threw her off. She shook her head, murmuring a quiet, "No thank you," and sat on the edge of the leather chair. He didn't press the issue. He simply folded his hands on the pristine surface of his desk and waited, the silence stretching, forcing her to be the one to break it, to be the supplicant. She took a shaky breath, the speech she had rehearsed 1,000 times dissolving in her mind. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice thinner than she wanted. I'm here about my father, David Vance." He just nodded, his expression unreadable, encouraging her to continue. So she did. She spoke of her father's long years of service, of his character, of the terrible mistake he had made. She didn't make excuses for him, but she pleaded for mercy, for an alternative to legal action that would destroy him completely. She even made the naive, desperate offer to work for him, to dedicate her life to paying back the impossible sum. "I'll do anything," she finished, the words hanging in the vast, silent office. "I'll get a second job, a third. I'll sign any contract. Please, just don't send him to prison." Julian listened to her entire plea without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. When she was finished, a long moment passed. He leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful, almost paternal look on his face that was deeply unsettling. "I appreciate your candor, Miss Vance," he said finally, his voice still perfectly level, "and your loyalty to your father is admirable. But the amount of money we are talking about is not something a recent graduate can repay in a lifetime of working multiple jobs. That is not a practical solution." Her heart sank. This was it, the rejection. "However," he continued, leaning forward slightly, "your offer to do anything is more interesting." He paused, letting the words sink in. "My business requires a great deal of my time. I attend numerous functions, charity galas, and weekend retreats. Often, these events are not suitable for a traditional date, but to attend alone can be a strategic disadvantage. I find myself in need of a companion, a personal assistant of sorts, whose duties would extend beyond the office." He spoke in crisp corporate terms, as if outlining a business proposal. The role would require absolute discretion, unwavering loyalty, and complete availability. It would involve travel, social engagement, and an understanding that your time is, for all intents and purposes, my time. Every sterile word was a carefully chosen veil for a crude, ugly truth. He never said what would happen in the private moments, on the weekends, away, in hotel suites, after the galas. He didn't have to. The unspoken part of the proposal screamed at her from across the gleaming desk. A wave of revulsion and white-hot shame washed over her. He wanted to buy her. In return for these specialized services, he concluded, his gaze unwavering, "I would be willing to consider the debt your father owes as settled internally. There would be no police, no prosecution. He would simply be terminated from his position, and the matter would be closed." He had laid the trap perfectly. Her father's freedom on one side, her body and soul on the other. He saw the conflict on her face, the horror warring with the desperate calculation. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "I don't expect an answer now, Miss Vance. This is a significant commitment. Go home, think about it. My assistant will contact you in 2 days for your decision." He walked her to the door, his hand hovering near the small of her back but never touching her. The gesture was somehow more violating than a physical touch. As she walked back down the long, silent hallway, her legs unsteady, she felt his cool, blue eyes on her back. She hadn't just been in a meeting. She had been appraised, valued, and given a price tag. The 2 days that followed his proposal were a unique form of torment, a silent, slow-motion agony. Alara moved through her family's apartment like a phantom. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Her parents, seeing a sliver of hope in her statement that she was handling it, dared not press her for details, terrified of shattering the fragile possibility of a solution. Their quiet, hopeful glances were like hot pokers against her skin. She saw the relief in her father's eyes, the way the deep lines of despair around his mouth had softened just a fraction, and she knew she had no choice. Every beat of her father's fragile hope was another nail in the coffin of her own future. Liam's calls went to voicemail. His texts, at first concerned, then confused, then hurt, piled up on her phone, each one a small digital twist of the knife. "Alara, what's going on? Just talk to me." How could she talk to him? How could she explain the filth she was about to willingly step into? The goodness and honesty of their relationship seemed like something from a distant lifetime, a paradise she was about to be permanently exiled from. On the morning of the second day, she sat at her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys. There was no real decision to be made, only a surrender to be formalized. She opened a new message to Catherine Shaw. The subject line was simply, your proposal. The body of the email contained only one word, I accept. She hit send before she could lose her nerve, then closed the laptop, feeling a profound, soul-deep coldness spread through her. The instructions arrived an hour later, as impersonal as the first email. A car would be waiting for her at the corner of her street at 7 p.m. on Friday. The final sentence was a chilling testament to the nature of their arrangement. "You need not bring anything with you." He didn't want her luggage, her books, her clothes. He didn't want any pieces of her old life cluttering his new acquisition. He wanted a blank slate. Friday arrived with the grim finality of an execution day. At 10 minutes to 7, she slipped out of the apartment telling her parents she was staying with a friend to study. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. The car was exactly where the email said it would be. A gleaming black sedan with tinted windows, its engine purring almost silently. A driver in a dark suit got out, opened the rear door for her without a word, and then they were gliding away into the city traffic. She watched her neighborhood, the familiar storefronts and brick buildings, disappear behind her, feeling like she was watching her own funeral procession. The driver never spoke, the partition between them was raised, and she was alone with her reflection in the dark glass, a ghost being ferried across the river Styx. The doorman at the base of his tower recognized the car and waved them through to a private underground entrance. Another silent elevator, this one requiring a keycard, opened not into a hallway, but directly into the penthouse itself. The doors slid open, and she stepped into a world of breathtaking, sterile beauty. The space was immense, a vast expanse of polished white marble and glass. It was less a home and more a private gallery. The furniture was sparse, a long, low-lying sofa, a few geometric armchairs, each piece clearly a priceless work of design. On the walls hung massive, challenging works of abstract art, and everywhere, those colossal windows. The setting sun had painted the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple, and the city was beginning to sparkle to life, a silent, dazzling spectacle laid out at her feet. The beauty of it was sharp, painful. It was the most beautiful prison she could ever have imagined. There was no sign of Julian. On a marble console table near the entrance, there was a single white envelope with her name on it, written in elegant, sharp calligraphy. Inside, a card simply directed her to the second guest suite on the left. Following the instruction, she walked down a long, silent corridor, her cheap heels echoing in the vastness. The room was larger than her entire living room at home. The bed was a huge, low platform dressed in immaculate white linens, and laid out on top of it was a long, flat box from a designer she recognized but could never afford, and a smaller, square one next to it. With trembling hands, she opened the larger box. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a slip dress made of the heaviest, most luxurious sapphire blue silk. It was simple, elegant, and impossibly expensive. The smaller box contained a set of black lace lingerie, so fine and delicate it seemed to be spun from shadow. This was her uniform, a costume for the role she was about to play, a brand marking her as his. She stood there for a long time, just looking at the clothes. Then, moving like an automaton, she went into the ensuite bathroom, a room of gray stone and chrome larger than her bedroom. She showered, letting the scalding water run over her skin as if it could wash away the shame, the fear. She dried herself with a towel that was impossibly thick and soft, and then she put on the lingerie. The delicate lace felt alien against her skin, a whisper of a fabric that was both a caress and a cage. Finally, she slipped the silk dress over her head. It pooled around her body, the cool, heavy fabric clinging and draping in a way that made her feel graceful and exposed all at once. She stared at the woman in the full-length mirror. The woman wore a dress the color of the midnight sky. Her dark hair, still slightly damp, framed a pale, beautiful face. She looked like a painting, a tragic heroine in the first act of a play. The only thing that betrayed her was her eyes. They were wide and dark, with a terror so profound it seemed to swallow all the light in the room. This was not her. This was Julian Croft's creation. She found him in the main living area, standing by the windows with 2 glasses and a bottle of wine. He had changed out of a suit and was now wearing dark, tailored trousers and a soft gray cashmere sweater. He looked relaxed, impossibly handsome, the lord of his entire glittering kingdom. He turned as he heard her approach, and his eyes swept over her, a slow, appraising look that made her feel naked despite the dress. A slow smile touched his lips. "Perfect," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I knew that color would be magnificent on you. Come, have a glass of wine." He didn't move towards her. He waited for her to cross the vast marble floor to him. It felt like the longest walk of her life. He handed her a glass of deep red wine. "A Bordeaux," he said, as if she'd asked. "From a small vineyard I happen to own. I find its complexity satisfying." He gestured to the sofa. "Please." The torture of it was in the civility. She had braced herself for a crude advance, a quick and brutal consummation of their ugly deal. Instead, he was playing the part of the charming, attentive host. He didn't speak of her father, of the money, of the reason she was standing in his home wearing his clothes. He asked her about her art history studies. He pointed to a chaotic, vibrant painting on the far wall. "What do you think of that one?" he asked, his head tilted. "It's a de Kooning. Most people find it aggressive. I find it honest." He drew her into a conversation, an intellectual seduction that was far more disorienting than any physical act would have been. He was engaging her mind, acknowledging her intelligence, treating her like an equal, all while the unspoken reality of their contract hung between them, thick and suffocating. She sat on the edge of the sofa, the wineglass cold in her trembling hand, giving clipped, barely audible answers. The city lights twinkled below, indifferent. The wine was rich and complex on her tongue, and the man who had bought her sat a few feet away, patiently, expertly, dismantling her defenses, one civilized sentence at a time. The conversation, if it could be called that, eventually withered and died. There were only so many academic observations Alara could offer about abstract expressionism, while her entire nervous system was screaming in silent panic. The silences between his questions and her clipped answers grew longer, heavier. Finally, Julian placed his wine glass on the marble coaster with a soft, definitive click. The sound, in the tomb-like quiet of the penthouse, was as loud as a gunshot. It was the signal. The performance was over, and the real purpose of the evening was about to begin. He rose from his chair, not with any suddenness, but with a fluid, deliberate grace that was unnerving. He moved to the vast window, looking down at the river of headlights flowing through the city streets below. "It's a beautiful view," he said, his back still to her. "It reminds me that everything, and everyone, has a price. It's simply a matter of finding Wooded Island." He turned then, and his cool blue eyes met hers. He crossed the space between them, and she felt an instinctual urge to flee, to shrink back into the sofa cushions, but her limbs were frozen, paralyzed by a dread so absolute it felt like ice in her veins. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne and the lingering aroma of the expensive wine on his breath. He didn't reach for her. He simply stood there, his presence an overwhelming force. "Stand up, Alara," he said. It wasn't a request. She obeyed, her body moving with a will of its own, a puppet whose strings he now held. Her legs felt unsteady as she rose to her feet. He was taller than she'd realized, and she had to tilt her head back slightly to look at him. This, too, felt like a calculated part of the humiliation, emphasizing her smallness, her powerlessness. His hand came up, and she flinched, a small, involuntary jerk. He seemed to notice, and a flicker of something amusement perhaps passed through his eyes. His touch was surprisingly gentle as his fingers brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "There is no need to be frightened," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel straight through her skin. "We have an agreement." The words, so calm and reasonable, were more brutal than a shout. This was the moment she had been steeling herself for, and still, a desperate, pathetic protest clawed its way out of her throat. "Mr. Croft, Julian, please," she whispered, her voice trembling so hard the name was barely recognizable. "Please don't." He didn't get angry. He didn't even seem annoyed. He simply let his hand slide from her cheek down to her jaw, his thumb stroking the delicate line of it. His touch was not passionate. It was possessive, the way one might examine a fine piece of porcelain before a purchase. "Alara," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a hypnotic, dangerous whisper. "Think of your father. Think of him sleeping in his own bed tonight, instead of on a cot in a jail cell. Think of your mother not having to endure the shame of seeing her husband's face on the evening news. This is the price, the one you agreed to pay." Each word was a precise surgical strike, dismantling her last shred of resistance. He was right. The choice had been made 2 days ago when she clicked send. This was just the collection of the debt. The fight went out of her, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. He took her silence as consent, which, in this terrible new reality, it was. His hand moved from her jaw to the small of her back, a firm, guiding pressure that propelled her forward. He led her out of the living area and down the long, silent corridor back to the bedroom, the so-called guest suite that was to be her cage. The walk felt like a mile. Her feet in the unfamiliar heels felt clumsy on the cold marble. All she could focus on was the steady, warm pressure of his hand on her back, steering her towards her own desecration. Once inside the room, he closed the door behind them, the soft click of the latch sounding like a prison bolt sliding into place. He didn't kiss her. He simply reached behind her and, with practiced impersonal efficiency, unzipped the beautiful sapphire dress. The heavy silk slithered down her body and pooled at her feet in a silent, shimmering heap. She stood before him in the delicate, expensive black lace he had bought for her, feeling utterly, obscenely exposed under the soft, recessed lighting of the room. He looked at her, his eyes doing a slow, clinical sweep from her face to her feet and back again. It wasn't the look of a lover, or even of a man filled with lust. It was the look of an art collector examining a new painting, of a tycoon assessing an asset. What happened next was a blur of detached sensations. She felt the cool air on her skin, the surprising weight of his body as he guided her back onto the enormous bed, the feel of the high thread count sheets against her bare back. She closed her eyes, but the image of the room, of him, was seared onto the inside of her eyelids. So she opened them again and chose a point on the far wall, a light fixture, a square, minimalist piece of metal, and focused on it with an intensity that bordered on madness. She mentally disassembled it, counting its sides, noting the way the light reflected off its surface. She tried to transport her mind there, into that cold, unfeeling object, anywhere but here, in this body that no longer felt like her own. His movements were efficient, unhurried, devoid of any pretense of passion. It was a mechanical act, a claiming of property. She felt the cool metal of his watch brush against her wrist, the rough texture of his cashmere sweater against her cheek. She registered the quiet, steady rhythm of his breathing, a sound that seemed to fill the entire universe. She remained perfectly still, a statue, her body rigid with a resistance her voice could no longer articulate. She bit down on her inner lip, so hard she tasted the coppery tang of blood, focusing on the small, sharp pain as an anchor in the overwhelming sea of violation. She would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. She would not give him the satisfaction of any sound at all. His climax was as controlled and quiet as the rest of him, a slight tensing of his muscles, a deepening of his breath, and then it was over. He pulled away from her immediately, the warmth and weight of him vanishing, leaving her feeling suddenly, intensely cold. She remained frozen, staring at the light fixture on the wall, her body coiled into a tight knot of shame. She heard the rustle of his clothing as he straightened himself. There was no tenderness, no shared intimacy, not even a word of feigned affection. He walked towards the bathroom, and the sound of running water filled the silence for a moment. When he came out, he was adjusting his cuffs, his composure perfectly restored, as if they had just concluded a business meeting. He paused at the door, looking back at her still form on the bed. "There are fresh towels in the bathroom," he said, his voice returning to its normal, businesslike tone. "I have an early meeting tomorrow. We'll talk in the morning." And then he was gone, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone in the vast, silent room. For a long time, she didn't move. Then, a single, shuddering tremor ran through her entire body. She slowly, achingly, curled into a ball, pulling the pristine white duvet around her shoulders. The expensive silk dress lay on the floor like a discarded snakeskin. The city lights still glittered outside the window, beautiful and uncaring. And in the gilded cage of the penthouse, under sheets that felt like ice, Alara Vance finally broke, not with a loud cry of anguish, but with a silence that was far more profound, the silent, internal shattering of a soul. The first night bled into the first week, and the first week into a month, and the initial, sharp-edged horror began to dull. worn down by the grim rhythm of a new and terrible routine. Her life split into two. A fractured existence lived across the East River. By day, she was still Alara Vance, the art history student, attending lectures in her worn jeans and faded sweaters, trying to focus on 14th century Italian painters, while the memory of Julian's cold, impersonal touch lingered on her skin like a phantom limb. But by night and on weekends, she was someone else entirely. She was his. The summons would come via a curt text from Catherine Shaw. "Mr. Croft requires your presence at the Penthouse this evening at 8. Or, pack an overnight bag for the weekend. The car will arrive at 3. There was no room for refusal, no option to decline. She had become an appointment in his calendar. In those first few weeks, Julian began the slow, methodical process of her transformation. He was not a crude man. He did not criticize or command. He simply corrected. He was molding her into a more suitable accessory, polishing his new possession until it gleamed. It started with her wardrobe. One afternoon, a team from a high-end department store arrived at the Penthouse, a silent, efficient army of stylists. Under Catherine's watchful eye, they filled a vast walk-in closet, her closet, she realized with a jolt, with an entire life's worth of clothing. There were cocktail dresses and evening gowns, tailored business suits, casual cashmere sets for weekends at his country estate, even exquisite lingerie that made the first set he'd bought her look modest. Her old clothes, the ones that held the scent of her real life, were packed away and vanished, as if they had never existed. From then on, she didn't choose what to wear. An itinerary left on her dresser would specify the event and the expected attire. She was being costumed for a role, and her personal taste was irrelevant. Then came the education. Julian seemed to take a perverse pleasure in refining her. During their silent, tense dinners, he would quiz her on the notes of the wine she was drinking. He would correct her grip on the fork, the way she pronounced a French dish. He sent her books, not novels or poetry, but thick volumes on global finance, contemporary art auctions, and international politics. "A beautiful woman is a pleasure," he told her one evening, his eyes cool and appraising over the rim of his wine glass. "A beautiful woman who can hold a conversation with a senator is an asset." He was upgrading her, improving his investment. There were appointments, all scheduled by Catherine, at the city's most exclusive salons. Her long, wild hair was tamed into a sophisticated, glossy style. Her nails were always perfectly manicured. Her skin was subjected to facials and treatments until it glowed. He was erasing the last traces of the girl from Queens and sculpting a creature of his own design. She endured it all with a numb, quiet compliance. It was a survival mechanism. She learned to build a wall inside her mind, a place where the real Alara could hide while the polished automaton he was creating went through the motions. This new existence took its toll on her old one, severing the threads that connected her to her past. Her world with Liam was the first casualty. He persisted for weeks, his texts growing more desperate. "Alara, I love you. Whatever is wrong, we can fix it. Please, just let me in." Finally, she agreed to meet him for coffee, a painful, gut-wrenching encounter at a small cafe that felt a world away from the Penthouse. She wore a simple, elegant blouse and trousers that Julian had bought her, and she saw Liam's eyes catch the glint of the delicate, expensive watch on her wrist. He looked tired, his face etched with a pain she had put there. She fed him a carefully constructed lie, the one she had also given her parents that missed her. Croft, in an act of extraordinary mercy, had hired her as a high-level personal assistant to pay off the debt. She claimed the long hours in travel were demanding, but that it was the only way. The lie felt flimsy and false even as she said it, and she could see in his eyes that he didn't quite believe it. "This isn't you, Alara," he said softly, his hand reaching for hers across the table. His touch was warm and familiar, a painful reminder of everything she was losing. "This job, it's changing you. You seem so distant." She pulled her hand away as if burned. "I have to do this, Liam," she said, her voice colder than she intended. "You wouldn't understand." The hurt that flashed across his face was so profound it almost made her break down, but she held it together. She ended it there, a cruel, clean break, telling him she didn't have time for a relationship. She walked away from him, leaving him sitting alone in the cafe, and felt a piece of her own soul die. With her family, the lie was more successful, which was somehow even more painful. Her parents, desperate to believe in a clean and honorable solution, accepted her story without question. They were filled with a mixture of relief and pride. Their daughter, their brilliant Alara, had saved the family with her intelligence and hard work. She began funneling them money, thousands of dollars that Julian provided through a generous salary, allowing them to pay their bills and breathe again. Her mother would hug her, crying with gratitude, telling her how proud she was. And Alara would stand there, wrapped in her mother's loving embrace, feeling like the most monstrous fraud in the world. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the gilded cage began to feel less like a cage and more like a habitat. The initial terror was replaced by a dull, predictable familiarity. She grew accustomed to the feel of silk sheets, the taste of perfectly prepared food, the silent deference of doormen and drivers. She learned to navigate high society events, to smile and make pleasant, empty conversation with powerful people. She learned to be the perfect, beautiful woman on Julian's arm, an object of envy for some and desire for others. One evening, she found herself at a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She was wearing a breathtaking gown of emerald green silk, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat. She was a world away from the girl in the library. She was laughing at a joke made by a well-known politician, a glass of champagne in her hand, when she caught her reflection in the mirrored surface of a nearby pillar. For a split second, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. The woman was poised, elegant, her smile perfectly crafted, her eyes sparkling under the grand chandeliers. But then the smile faltered, and for just a moment, Alara saw past the polished facade. She saw the hollowness, the profound, terrifying emptiness in the eyes of the beautiful stranger she had become. The week settled into a predictable, monotonous rhythm of numb compliance. Alara had perfected the art of dissociation, of separating her mind from her body, allowing the polished shell of a woman to perform her duties, while the real her remained hidden, dormant. She believed she had mastered the arrangement, that she could survive it by becoming a ghost in her own life. She was wrong. The shift happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Julian had been uncharacteristically quiet for 2 days, and she had been left alone, a brief, hollow respite. Then came the text from Catherine. "Mr. Croft will collect you at 6 p.m. Attire is business casual." She had expected another sterile dinner or a political fundraiser. Instead, the car took them to a private gallery in Soho. The gallery was closed to the public, the lights dimmed, the cavernous space silent save for their footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The owner, a friend of Julian's, had opened it just for them. The exhibition was of a modern painter, Alara deeply admired, an artist whose work she had written a lengthy paper on just last semester. She was momentarily stunned. Julian walked beside her, not speaking at first, allowing her to take it all in. She found herself forgetting who she was with, forgetting the ugly contract that bound them. She was just a student again, in a room full of genius, and she began to talk. The words tumbled out of her, genuine and passionate, as she explained the artist's use of color, the emotional turmoil conveyed in the aggressive brushstrokes. She wasn't performing. For the first time in months, she was simply being herself. And Julian listened. He didn't just listen, he engaged, asking intelligent, insightful questions. He challenged one of her interpretations, not dismissively, but with a thoughtful counter-argument that forced her to defend her position. For an hour, they were not a monster and his victim. They were two sharp minds discussing a shared interest. He was looking at her not as an object he owned, but as a person with a brain he found intriguing. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. He had found a chink in her armor, a part of her she hadn't known how to hide. When they returned to the penthouse, the atmosphere was different. The usual oppressive silence was replaced by a charged, humming energy. She was still buzzing from the intellectual stimulation, from feeling like herself again, however briefly. Julian poured them both a brandy, his movements relaxed. "You're wasted as a student, Alara," he said, his voice a low murmur as he handed her the glass. "Your insight is sharper than half the critics I read." The compliment landed with unnerving precision, bypassing the walls she had so carefully built and striking somewhere deep inside. It was a praise for her mind, the one part of herself she thought was still hers alone. He stood close to her by the window, the city lights a glittering tapestry behind him. She was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from his body. When he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, she didn't flinch. His fingers were warm against her skin, and a strange, unfamiliar shiver traced its way down her spine. "Julian," she started, a weak, automatic protest. "We shouldn't." The words had no conviction. She wasn't sure what they even meant anymore. "Shouldn't what?" he whispered, his eyes holding hers. "Have a conversation? Enjoy an evening?" He was deliberately misinterpreting her, playing a game she didn't know the rules to. His other hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like the brutal, silent claiming of their first encounter. This was a real kiss, slow and searching, his lips firm but surprisingly gentle. Her mind screamed in protest, a chorus of shame and betrayal and disgust. This is the man who bought you. This is a transaction. This is not real. But her body, which had been a cold, numb vessel for so long, betrayed her with a shocking, violent suddenness. It was a desert suddenly flooded, a starved thing finally being fed. A soft, involuntary sigh escaped her lips, and she felt herself leaning into him, her hands coming up to tentatively rest on the soft cashmere of his sweater. The kiss deepened, and the brandy snifter slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Neither of them noticed. The numbness that had been her shield for weeks was cracking, melting away under the unexpected heat of his touch. He led her to the bedroom, and this time, there was no cold, silent march. His mouth never left hers, his hands mapping the curves of her back, her waist, her hips, through the thin silk of her blouse. When they reached the bed, the movements were no longer mechanical. There was a desperate, hungry quality to them, a raw need that seemed to come from both of them. This time, she did not stare at the ceiling. Her eyes were closed, lost in a maelstrom of new and terrifying sensations. The scent of his cologne was no longer clinical. It was intoxicating. The feel of his skin against hers was not a violation, but a source of searing, undeniable pleasure. He whispered her name, not a command, but a breathy, ragged sound against her neck. "Alara, you feel so good." And in response, a sound tore from her throat that she didn't recognize, a low moan that was equal parts pleasure and despair. She was no longer a spectator to her body's humiliation. She was an active participant in her own downfall. Her body, so long held in a state of rigid control, arched against his, seeking more, seeking friction, seeking release. And when the climax came, it was not the quiet internal shattering of before. It was a violent, convulsive wave that rocked her entire being, pulling a raw cry from her lips. It was a purely physical release, divorced from love or emotion, but it was so powerful, so absolute, that it felt like it broke something deep inside her. In the aftermath, they lay tangled in the sheets, the sound of their ragged breathing slowly returning to normal. The silence that descended was different this time. It wasn't empty, it was heavy with what had just happened. She expected him to leave, to retreat into his cold, businesslike persona, but he didn't. He shifted slightly, pulling her against his side, his arm draped possessively over her waist. He didn't speak. He just held her. This small, simple gesture of intimacy was the most dangerous thing he had ever done. The coldness had been easy to hate, to define herself against. But this confusing, counterfeit tenderness was a poison that went straight to the soul. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, he released her, got up, and left the room without a word. She lay in the darkness, her body still humming with the aftershocks of a pleasure she was ashamed to have felt. She slowly brought a trembling hand up to her lips, the phantom sensation of his kiss still burning there. The numbness was gone. Her carefully constructed walls were in ruins, and in their place, a single, terrifying, and undeniable flicker of desire had taken root, threatening to burn her entire world to the ground. The flicker of desire, once ignited, refused to be extinguished. It smoldered beneath the surface of her days, a secret, shameful warmth that she carried with her into lecture halls and libraries. The nights with Julian were no longer cold, sterile transactions. The dynamic had been irrevocably altered. A dark, intoxicating chemistry now charged the air between them, a dangerous fusion of power, dependency, and a raw, illicit lust that left her feeling hollowed out and shamefully alive. She stopped fighting the pleasure he gave her, and in doing so, she began to lose the fight for herself. The clear, bright line between victim and participant blurred into a murky, unrecognizable gray. Her compliance was no longer numb and passive. It became active, intuitive. She transformed into a flawless study of his needs, an expert in the silent language of his desires. She learned the precise moment to refill his brandy without being asked, the exact temperature he preferred for his morning coffee, which section of the newspaper to place on top. She learned to read the subtle tension in his jaw after a difficult day of business and knew to fill the vast penthouse with the soft, melancholic notes of a particular classical composer he favored. These small domestic acts were insidious, weaving a dangerous illusion of normalcy, of intimacy, of something that looked dangerously like a relationship. Her performance outside the penthouse became just as polished. She was no longer the terrified girl playing dress-up. At his side during galas and business dinners, she was poised and radiant. She learned to navigate conversations with titans of industry and their calculating wives. Her knowledge gleaned from the books Julian had given her, allowing her to contribute with a quiet, impressive intelligence. She learned to deflect questions about her background with a charming, practiced vagueness. She became a beautiful, enigmatic puzzle that people admired, and she began to draw a perverse sense of satisfaction from their admiration. The power that came with being Julian's companion was a potent, addictive drug. One afternoon, wanting a moment to herself, she tried to get a table at a famously exclusive restaurant for lunch, only to be told coolly by the hostess that they were booked for months. On a whim, Alara said quietly, "Could you please check again? The reservation might be under Croft." The hostess's disdainful expression vanished, replaced by a fawning, panicked eagerness. Suddenly, the best table in the restaurant was available. Sitting there, surrounded by luxury, treated with a deference she had done nothing to earn, she felt a dizzying, shameful thrill. For the first time, the bars of her gilded cage glittered not with menace, but with allure. She began to tell herself a new story. She was not a victim. She was a pragmatist, a survivor. Julian was not a monster. He was a complex, demanding man who, in his own way, appreciated her. Hadn't he shown her the private gallery? Didn't he praise her intelligence? She started to see his control not as ownership, but as a form of protection, a buffer against the harsh realities of the world. She was safe in his tower of glass and steel. The lies she told the world about her high-paying job began to feel less like a fabrication and more like a different version of the truth. After all, wasn't she working for her security? Wasn't she earning her keep? The self-deception was a comforting balm on the raw wound of her conscience. The true test of her transformation came on a bright Wednesday afternoon. Julian had given her a new handbag, a casual gift that was, in reality, a status symbol, so potent it was practically a weapon, an iconic Hermes Birkin in a soft, elegant shade of gray. Carrying it felt like wearing a costume of immense wealth. She was in an upscale boutique in Soho, a place she now frequented with the casual ease of someone who belonged when she heard a familiar voice call her name. "Alara? Oh my God, is that you?" It was Chloe, one of her closest friends from her art history program, someone from the before life she now kept at arm's length. Chloe's eyes were wide, first with the pleasure of recognition, and then with undisguised shock as she took in Alara's appearance, the perfectly styled hair, the tailored silk blouse, the quiet gleam of her diamond stud earrings, and finally, the bag resting on the chair beside her. "Wow," Chloe breathed, her gaze fixed on the purse. "You look amazing, like seriously incredible. Is that a Birkin?" The question hung in the air. This was the moment where the old Alara would have stammered, blushed, and fumbled for an excuse, but the old Alara was gone. The new Alara smiled, a calm, easy expression that she had practiced in the mirror 100 times. "It is," she said, her voice smooth. "It was a bonus. My boss is incredibly generous." Chloe's jaw practically dropped. "A bonus? Ilara, that thing costs more than my dad's car. What kind of assistant job is this?" The lie flowed from her with unnerving ease, polished and plausible. She spoke of handling multi-million-dollar art acquisitions for Julian's private collection, of liaising with international clients, of the immense pressure and the equally immense rewards. She painted a picture of a demanding but brilliant career, of a life so dazzling and fast-paced that she simply hadn't had a moment to catch up with old friends. She was so convincing that she almost believed it herself. Chloe listened, her expression a mixture of awe and a faint, troubling skepticism. "Well," she said finally, a little awkwardly, "I'm happy for you. It's just a lot. You've changed." The words, meant as an observation, landed like a conviction. After a few more minutes of strained pleasantries, Chloe made her excuses and left. Alara sat alone at the small table, the expensive coffee suddenly tasting bitter. Chloe's words echoed in her ears. "You've changed." The lie she had just told so effortlessly felt like a thick, suffocating film around her. For a moment, she saw herself through Chloe's eyes, a girl who had vanished from her own life and reappeared as this glossy, unrecognizable stranger with a story that didn't quite add up. A sharp, painful pang of guilt pierced through her carefully constructed defenses. She felt a desperate longing for her old life, for the simple honesty of sharing a cheap pizza with a friend who knew her, truly knew her, but the feeling was fleeting. It was immediately suppressed, pushed down by a harder, colder wave of justification. "She doesn't understand," Alara told herself, her fingers tightening around the smooth leather handle of the Birkin bag. "She doesn't know what I had to do to save my family. Her life is easy. She has no right to judge me." The thought was a comfort, a shield. It created a necessary distance, placing her on one side of a deep chasm, and everyone from her past on the other. That evening, back in the silent perfection of the penthouse, she placed the handbag on the marble island in the kitchen. It sat there under the recessed lighting, a monument to her new reality. It was the price of her father's freedom, the spoils of her own damnation. She traced the fine stitching with her finger. The guilt was still there, a faint, humming vibration deep within her, but it was buried now, entombed beneath layers of silk, diamonds, and the beautiful, ugly lies she was beginning to believe were the truth. The polished artifice of her life, so carefully constructed, was shattered by a single, devastating encounter. It was Liam. He had asked to see her one last time, his text message devoid of the pleading hope that had marked his earlier attempts, replaced by a quiet, somber finality. They met on a bench near the East River, the place where he had first told her he loved her. The irony was a cruel, physical ache in her chest. He looked different, thinner, the easy, optimistic light in his eyes extinguished, replaced by a weary, bruised wisdom. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply laid out the truth as he had pieced it together. He'd seen a picture online from a society blog covering a charity auction. It was a candid shot. Julian Croft, looking powerful and possessive, with his hand on the back of a woman in an emerald green dress. The woman was Alara. "I was a fool," Liam said, his voice low and steady, his gaze fixed on the churning gray water of the river. "I actually believed you, a high-powered assistant. I thought, of course, she's brilliant, they saw her potential. I was so proud of you. Even while I missed you so much, it felt like I couldn't breathe." He finally turned to look at her, and the raw, unfiltered pain in his eyes was like a physical blow. But that man in the picture, he wasn't looking at his assistant, Alara, and you weren't looking at your boss. He took a shaky breath. "I don't care about the money. I don't care that you're with him. I care that you didn't think we were worth fighting for. I would have done anything. I would have gotten a second job. We would have moved into a smaller place. We would have fought it together. But you didn't even tell me. You just vanished. You chose this. You chose him." Every word was the truth. Every word was a verdict, stripping away the lies she had told herself, the justifications she had wrapped around her like a shield. She had chosen the easy, damning solution over the hard, honest love he had offered. There was nothing she could say, no defense she could mount. Her silence was her confession. He stood up, a final, heartbreakingly gentle look on his face. "I hope it's worth it," he whispered. "Goodbye, Alara." And he walked away, leaving her on the bench with the ghost of their shared future and the full, crushing weight of her choices. She completely unraveled. The carefully controlled composure she had cultivated for months dissolved into a storm of racking sobs. She was a ruin, a fraud, a coward. The beautiful clothes, the expensive watch, the perfect hair, it was all a costume for a hollowed-out thing. And in that moment of absolute devastation, she didn't go to her parents. She didn't call Chloe. The thought of their wholesome, uncomprehending sympathy was unbearable. There was only one person in the world who would understand the ugly, twisted reality of her life. There was only one place she could go where she didn't have to pretend. In a daze of grief, she got into a taxi, the address of the Penthouse falling from her lips like a prayer. For the first time, she was going there unsummoned. She was flying to the heart of her own prison, because it was the only home she had left. She must have been a sight, bursting out of the private elevator, her face blotchy and swollen, tears streaming down her cheeks, her perfect hair a mess. Julian was in his study, and he looked up, his expression of calm control momentarily replaced by genuine surprise. He had only ever seen her placid and composed, or, in their more intimate moments, a creature of reluctant, then willing, pleasure. He had never seen her like this, completely, utterly broken. She didn't wait for him to speak. She crossed the room in a few desperate strides and launched herself at him, a raw, wounded animal seeking, what? Comfort? Oblivion? She didn't know. Her mouth crashed against his, a frantic, clumsy kiss that tasted of salt and grief. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him down to her, a silent, desperate plea for him to make the pain go away. Alara, he said, his voice tight with surprise as he gripped her arms, holding her back for a second to look at her. But she just shook her head, a sob catching in her throat, and kissed him again, harder this time. It was a kiss not of seduction, but of annihilation. She was trying to erase Liam's face from her mind, trying to replace the sound of his heartbroken voice with pure physical sensation. Something shifted in Julian's eyes. He saw the totality of her surrender, the depth of her brokenness, and he understood. He understood that she had finally, irrevocably, chosen him and his world over everything she had once been. He stopped resisting, and his arms went around her, pulling her tight against him, meeting her desperate, frantic energy with a deep, consuming passion of his own. This was not the cold transaction of their first encounter, nor the calculated seduction of their second. This was something else entirely. It was raw, primal, and stripped of all pretense. He lifted her, and she wrapped her legs around his waist as he carried her from the study, their mouths still locked together. He didn't take her to the pristine guest suite. He took her to his own room, to his own bed, a domain she had never entered before. Clothes were torn away with a reckless, desperate haste. There were no soft words, no gentle caresses. It was a storm of skin and breath and motion. Every touch was bruising, every kiss was devouring. She met his intensity with her own, a wild, grieving fury pouring out of her. She guided his hands, her hips moving with a frantic rhythm, her body a live wire of pain and sensation. The sounds she made were not the soft moans of manufactured pleasure. They were raw, guttural cries torn from the deepest part of her, a chaotic symphony of anguish and arousal. "Julian, harder," she begged, the word a sob against his skin. "Please, don't stop." She wanted him to drive everything else out, to leave room for nothing in her head but the blinding, searing reality of her own body. The climax, when it came, was a violent, shattering detonation. It was an explosion of grief and pleasure so intense that for a few blissful seconds, she felt absolutely nothing at all, just a white-hot, empty piece. In the ringing silence that followed, they lay tangled in the disheveled sheets of his bed. Her tears had dried, leaving salty tracks on her skin. The adrenaline faded, and the profound, aching emptiness rushed back in to fill the void. He shifted, pulling her head onto his chest, his fingers stroking her sweat-damp hair. He held her, and she let him, too exhausted to move, too broken to care. The pain of losing Liam was still there, a deep, throbbing wound in her soul. But as she lay there, listening to the steady, powerful beat of her captor's heart beneath her ear, a new and chilling realization dawned. She had run from the memory of a love that was pure and good, and had sought refuge in the arms of the man who had destroyed it. She had willingly fled to her cage, seeking comfort from the one who held the key. In that moment, lying in his bed in his room, she knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back. The point of no return had not been a line she was forced across, but a door she had just willingly, desperately walked right through. After the storm of her confrontation with Liam, a strange, unsettling calm descended upon Alara's life. The final, painful severance from her past had been a baptism by fire, and she had emerged from it transformed, remade in the image of Julian's world. She abandoned the pretense of her studies, letting her classes and the future she once planned for herself fade away like a forgotten dream. She moved her remaining belongings from her parents' small apartment into the vast, silent penthouse. She told them the lie had evolved. Her job now required her to live on-site, a promotion that came with a significant pay raise. They were overjoyed for her, their pride a constant, bitter reminder of the depth of her deception. She was now, in every sense, Julian's creature. Her days were no longer her own, but were structured around his schedule, his needs, his desires. A strange and twisted domesticity took root. They would have breakfast together on the terrace overlooking the awakening city, a silent ritual of coffee and newspapers that felt unnervingly like a marriage. She would accompany him to his tailor, offering her opinion on fabrics. She would plan his dinner parties, curating menus and guest lists with the skill of a seasoned socialite. The nights were no longer just about sex. They were about a consuming, possessive intimacy. He had moved her into his own bedroom, and she would fall asleep in his arms, his steady breathing a comforting presence in the dark. He could be, at times, surprisingly tender, his touch gentle after the ferocity of their passion. In this unsettling calm, a dangerous and foolish seed of hope began to grow in the barren soil of Alara's heart. She started to misinterpret his possessiveness as care, his lust as a form of love. She mistook the perfect, frictionless ease of their life together for genuine partnership. She saw the way he looked at her across a crowded room, a look of undisguised ownership, and she told herself it was pride. She started to believe that she had transcended the original, ugly bargain. She was no longer just an asset paying off a debt. She had become something more, something necessary to him. This fragile hope grew until it became a need, a desperate yearning for validation, for a sign that the life she had sacrificed everything for was real. She needed to redefine the terms, to hear from him that their arrangement had evolved beyond a simple contract. She needed to know what she was to him. She chose her moment carefully. It was a quiet evening, and he was in his study, the one room in the penthouse that remained his exclusive domain. It was the seat of his power, a fortress of dark wood, leather, and the faint, clean scent of money. She had never been summoned there for anything other than a practical, businesslike instruction. She entered without knocking, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He was sitting at his massive desk, reviewing a document, the lamplight carving his handsome, severe features out of the shadows. He looked up, a flicker of surprise in his cool blue eyes. "Alara," he said, his voice neutral. "I thought you were reading." She walked towards the desk, her hands clasped in front of her to still their trembling. "I need to talk to you, Julian," she said, her voice softer and more vulnerable than she intended. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing for her to continue, his expression patient, unreadable. The mask was perfectly in place. "The arrangement," she began, struggling to find the right words. "The reason I first came here, to my father's debt. It's been months now. With the salary you give me, with everything, surely it's been repaid by now." He said nothing, his stillness an unnerving counterpoint to her own turmoil. She pressed on, the words tumbling out in a rush. "What is this now, Julian? What are we? I've given up everything. I live here with you. I share your bed. This has become more than the original agreement, hasn't it? I need to know that this is real, that I am more to you than just that." The word payment hung in the air between them, unspoken but deafening. He listened to her entire, heartfelt plea without a single change in his expression. When she was finished, the silence in the room was absolute. He picked up a heavy silver pen from his desk, turning it over and over in his long, elegant fingers. "You are asking for clarification on the terms of our relationship," he stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. It was the tone he used with his lawyers. "Very well." He placed the pen down with a soft click. "Let me be perfectly clear. First, regarding your father, there was never any real danger of prosecution. The initial threat was merely a test, an initial investment to see if you were a commodity worth acquiring. The embezzlement was real, but I had already decided to handle it internally. Sending a man like your father to prison would have been a messy, inefficient, and frankly boring solution. The blood drained from Alara's face. Every word was a blow, dismantling the very foundation of her sacrifice. A test? She whispered, horrified. But my family, You were desperate. He finished for her, his voice flat, and your desperation made you valuable. He leaned forward, his gaze pinning her in place. Second, you ask what you are to me. You are a delight, Alara. You are beautiful, intelligent, and you have been a fascinating project. I have enjoyed molding you, refining you. Our nights together are stimulating. But you must not confuse my enjoyment of an asset with the foolishness of emotional attachment. Love is a liability I divested from years ago. I am not in love with you. I will never be in love with you. The hope that had bloomed within her withered and died in an instant, turning to ash in her chest. She felt a wave of nausea, of profound, soul-deep humiliation. She had been a game, a project, a toy. And finally, he continued, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper, you must understand your position. You believe the debt is paid? You are more indebted to me now than you ever were. Look at yourself. You wear my clothes, you eat my food. The money you so dutifully send to your parents comes from me. You have no degree, no job, no friends from your old life. You have nothing that I have not given you. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a slim file, sliding it across the polished desk towards her. Your entire existence is a construct of my design. She opened the file with trembling hands. Inside were photographs. Pictures of her and Liam during their final, terrible meeting. Pictures of her mother, crying with relief after receiving the money Alara had sent. And a detailed financial statement showing every dollar he had spent on her, from the first sapphire dress to the diamond earrings she was wearing right now. It was a ledger of her soul. You see, Julian said, his voice as soft and deadly as a razor's edge, I own you. Not because of your father's pathetic little crime, but because you have willingly given me every piece of yourself. You are trapped not by a contract, Alara, but by your own choices. The psychological blow was absolute. She saw the full, horrifying scope of his game and her own tragic, foolish role within it. The sacrifice, the pain, the lost love, it was all for nothing, all for the amusement of the cold, brilliant monster sitting in front of her. He had won so completely that she hadn't even realized they were playing. He stood up, walked around the desk, and gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. Her eyes were blank with shock, brimming with unshed tears. Now, he said, his voice softening into the familiar, possessive murmur she had mistaken for affection, stop this foolishness, be the smart, beautiful girl I've invested in, and make us a drink. It's been a long day. The command was gentle, but it was the most brutal thing he had ever said. It was the final affirmation of her status. She wasn't his partner. She wasn't even his lover. She was just a part of the Penthouse furnishings, and her only function was to serve its master. The revelation in the study did not break Alara in the way a storm breaks a tree, with a loud, violent crack. It was a quieter, more profound destruction. It was the way a killing frost settles overnight, silently turning every living, vibrant cell to ice. The hope, the foolish, desperate hope that she had meant something more, had been the last warm thing inside her. Now, it was gone. She stood before him, the file of photographs, a damning testament to her own folly, and saw not a man, but a grandmaster who had just declared checkmate in a game she never knew she was playing. He had told her to make them a drink. And so, she did. She turned, her movements unnervingly fluid and graceful, and walked to the crystal decanters on the mahogany sideboard. Her hands were perfectly steady as she poured 2 fingers of his favorite single malt scotch into 2 heavy glasses. She did not cry, she did not scream. The part of her that could do those things had just been executed. What was left was a hollow, beautiful shell, programmed only for obedience. She brought him the glass, her expression serene, her eyes as vacant and reflective as polished stone. In the days that followed, Julian observed the emergence of his final, perfect creation. The conflicted, vulnerable girl was gone, and in her place stood a queen. She was the queen of his penthouse, his social life, his bed, but her reign was one of flawless, chilling emptiness. She was magnificent. She managed his household with an efficiency that surpassed even Catherine's. She orchestrated his social events with the strategic brilliance of a general. At his side, she was no longer just an intelligent beauty. She was a dazzling enigma, her conversation witty and insightful, her smile a brilliant, impenetrable shield. She had learned the rules, and she played the game better than he could have ever imagined. Her performance was so complete, so absolute, that it was indistinguishable from reality to any outside observer. About a week after the revelation, she hosted a small, exclusive dinner party at the Penthouse for a group of his most important investors. Alara was a vision in a simple, backless black gown, her hair swept up, a single strand of perfect pearls at her throat. She moved among the guests, a word here, a laugh there, her charm effortless, her grace innate. She was the ultimate asset, reflecting his own power and taste back at the world with blinding luminosity. Julian watched her, a deep, proprietary satisfaction settling in his chest. He had done it. He had taken a raw, defiant girl and had broken her, then reforged her into this exquisite masterpiece. She was everything he wanted. Intelligent, beautiful, and utterly, completely his, her will entirely sublimated to his own. Later in the evening, as Alara was speaking with the wife of a Swiss banker, the older woman, herself a creature of transactional marriages, leaned in conspiratorially. "My dear," the woman murmured, her eyes glinting with a mixture of envy and camaraderie. "I must say, you are extraordinary. The way you manage him, the way you've created this perfect world for him. You're not just a beauty, you're a true professional." The words, meant in their world as the highest form of compliment, landed on Alara with no impact whatsoever. She simply smiled her dazzling, empty smile. "Julian is a remarkable man," she replied, her voice like soft velvet. "He deserves a remarkable life." It was the perfect answer, the professional answer. The change was most profound in the moments the world couldn't see. Their intimacy, once a chaotic battleground of her shame and desire, became another stage for her performance. She had learned his body as she had learned his taste in wine, with the detached precision of a scholar. She knew what he wanted before he did, and she gave it to him with a skill that was breathtaking. She could perform passion with an artistry that was flawless, her moans perfectly timed, her body arching at the precise moment to elicit the greatest response from him. She could ride the waves of his desire, guiding him, pleasing him, all while her mind was 1,000 miles away, a calm, quiet, empty space. She felt nothing. Not pleasure, not shame, not even the ghost of desire. Her body was simply an instrument she played with masterful skill to fulfill her function, to ensure the continued frictionless peace of her existence. She had, in a way, won. She had achieved a state of perfect detachment. He could own her body, but he could no longer touch her mind, because there was nothing left inside to touch. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, when Julian's breathing was a deep, steady rhythm beside her, a phantom limb would ache. The perfect, hollow queen would slip out of bed and walk to the vast windows, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floor. She would stand there, a solitary, statuesque figure against the glittering, indifferent city. She would look out across the dark water towards the distant lights of Brooklyn, and the ghost of a memory would surface. A memory of a boy with a camera, of walks in the park, of a dream of a small apartment filled with books and light. It wasn't sadness she felt, not anymore. Sadness required a heart to feel it. It was a quieter, more factual sensation. It was the detached acknowledgement of a life that had belonged to someone else, a girl named Alara Vance who had died a long time ago. She would trace the delicate arch of the Brooklyn Bridge with her finger on the cold glass, a silent eulogy for a future that had been forfeited. Then, she would turn away from the window, her reflection in the dark glass that of a beautiful, perfect stranger. She would slide back into the bed, into the arms of the man who had created her, her expression serene and placid in the moonlight. The game was over. The master had won, and she had perfected her role as his prize, the hollow queen on his gilded throne, reigning over a kingdom of beautiful, silent, empty things. A year passed, then another. The seasons changed outside the vast penthouse windows, the city shifting from the brutal heat of summer to the soft, melancholic fall of snow, but inside, time had lost its meaning. Alara's existence was a series of perfectly executed moments, a life curated into a flawless, repeating pattern of galas, dinners, and quiet, luxurious weekends. The Hollow Queen had perfected her reign. The memory of the girl who had loved art history and a young photographer was a distant academic fact, like a story she had once read about a stranger. She was no longer haunted by her past, because she no longer had one. There was only the long, serene, and empty present. Then, one evening, on the second anniversary of the night she first walked into his apartment, Julian did something unexpected. He presented her with a slim, leather-bound portfolio. Inside was a series of legal documents, all expertly prepared by his team of lawyers, and on top, a debit card made of brushed black metal bearing her name, Alara Vance. The original debt your father incurred has been, for the sake of appearances, repaid with interest from your salary, Julian said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. He gestured to the card. This is a private account in your name. It contains a significant sum, enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life, should you choose. The documents legally absolve your father of any past or future liability. There are no more ties, no more obligations. He looked at her, his cool blue eyes searching her perfect, placid face. You are free, Alara. You can walk out that door right now, and nothing and no one will stop you. He said the word free, as if it were a final, precious gift he was bestowing upon her. A declaration of her complete and total liberation. The cage door, which she had long ago stopped rattling, had just been swung wide open. Alara looked at the portfolio in her hands. She felt the weight of the fine leather, saw the crisp edges of the paper, the embossed letters of her own name on the card, and she felt nothing. No surge of joy, no gasp of relief, no triumphant sense of release. The words, the documents, the money, they were all abstract concepts, symbols from a language she no longer spoke. The idea of leaving was a thought so alien it had no shape. She tried, in a detached, clinical way, to imagine it, to walk out the door. And go where? Back to the small apartment in Queens? She would be a stranger there, a creature of silk and diamonds invading a world of worn furniture and quiet, working-class pride. Her parents would be confused by her sudden return, by the fortune she now possessed. How could she ever explain the truth of where it came from? The lie she had built to protect them had become a wall that now permanently separated her from them. And Liam? The thought of him was a faint, painless echo. He was gone, had moved on. His name a footnote in a story about a girl who no longer existed. Her old friends, like Chloe, were living real lives, building careers, falling in love. She was a ghost from their past, a beautiful cautionary tale they might sometimes whisper about. There was no one to go back to. But more profoundly, there was no her to go back. The Alara Vance who could have existed in that world had been systematically dismantled, piece by piece, within these very walls. Who was she without the clothes Julian had chosen for her, without the opinions he had cultivated in her, without the role she played as his consort? She was a collection of learned behaviors, a reflection of his desires. Freedom, she realized with a chilling, silent clarity, was not a bank account or a legal document. Freedom was the ability to feel, to hope, to love, to make a choice that was truly your own. Freedom was having a soul, and hers had been traded away so long ago she could barely remember what it felt like. The cage was no longer the penthouse or the debt or Julian himself. The cage was the emptiness inside her. She had been a prisoner for so long that she no longer knew how to live without the bars. That night, she stood by the window, the leather portfolio resting on a nearby table. She was dressed for another of his events, a vision in silver, her neck and wrists glittering with jewels. The city spread out before her, a universe of infinite possibilities, of millions of other lives being lived. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass. A woman of incredible beauty and poise stared back, her expression serene, her eyes holding the placid, empty calm of a deep frozen lake. She was the master's perfect creation. She had everything a woman could ever want, and nothing that she had ever needed. And as she stared at the beautiful, hollow stranger in the glass, a single perfect tear escaped her eye. It was a slow, silent betrayal of her composure, tracing a glistening path through her flawless makeup. It was not a tear of sadness, for sadness was a feeling, and she had none left. It was not a tear of joy, for joy was a memory from another life. It was a tear of pure, elemental loss, a final, physical acknowledgement from a body that still remembered, even if her mind could not, that it had once housed a soul. The tear fell from her chin and vanished into the night. She did not wipe its track away. She simply stood there, motionless, her freedom resting on the table beside her, utterly and completely useless. The door was open, but she made no move to leave. She was a queen on a throne, in a prison of her own choosing, and she would remain there until the end of her days, reigning over her magnificent, beautiful, and silent cage.